Thank you. Well, my research method is very different to Boyko's. I use scruffy photocopies, notebooks and pencils, and just slog through things. So, is, as I say, quite different. So Dion Fortune, to give the most public name of Violet Mary Firth, has been very influential in the Western magical tradition for the last 100 years. She differs from other women who acknowledged its influence or stayed within the Theosophical movement because her involvement with the practical Kabbalah, the use of psychology, dedicated and frequent working with the Western entities, and in running her own mystery school, which strives still. She was a prolific author, both of fiction, and if we are to accept certain premises to be true, non-fiction too. Her sales numbers will never beat those of Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, Ella Wheeler Wilcox or Alice Bailey, but as an esoteric bookseller, I know that the path of the mystic is much more popular than that of the magician. Diluted mysticism can be and is sprinkled with fairy dust and saccharin, but magic demands hard work, not just long evenings of studying by the meter of densely written expositions on aspects of the great other in all its variety of wonders. The great success of Ellen Cannon Reid and Doreen Virtue are current examples of this. Dion Fortune's books are consistently steady sellers and appeal to men as well as women, which of Doreen Virtue, for instance, and the current mystics, their work tends not to. It's very much product, it's aimed at postmenopausal women, and it's cynical. As I say, it's product, it's a way of making money. Dion Fortune's books are consistently, we don't stock them. Dion Fortune's books are consistently steady sellers and appeal to men as well as women, which Cannon Reid and Virtue largely do not. Her work is concerned, like theirs, with personal improvement and achievement, but unlike modern-day mystics with product to sell, she demands regular inner work being done, not simply picking an affirmation card every day. Collaboration in pairs or in smallish groups, holding together through mutual respect and having the results acknowledged in the mundane world, is, I suspect, preferable to those of the inner planes than the mass of people who are content to believe that seeing a feather means that an angel is passing by. After her death, the next generation found themselves in opposition to the old guard within the Society of the Inner Light, and what they perceived as the cult of personality that had grown up around her. So they destroyed diaries, notebooks and photographs. The Society has had several years now to really regret that, as the interest in Dion Fortune grows yearly, and it was pioneered by Alan Richardson, by Gareth Knight, who was a part of the Society, and it grows year on year. Her books are still fairly much all in print. It's a rolling process, and the interest in her and how she did what she did is growing all the time. So there are the same 3 photographs that everybody sees, because that's all that's being left. So, because of their actions, there's very good reason to give a big thank you to the Theosophical Society and its wonderful library here in Gloucester Place. Because the librarian, Barry Thompson, has been immensely helpful and charming to me, so I recommend you all taking advantage of him and the other people here who know what is where and what lies within. They don't just look up things on a computer. It's in their DNA, so exploit them, make the most of it. Leslie Price holds a very special place in my heart for being so unstinting in his health, although my affection did shrink a bit when I started working on the Vahan. No, it's all gone wrong already. No, this isn't the right one. Never mind, I'll just have to blag it. That's, some of those weren't meant to be there. As I say, because the Vahan is published on oatmeal-coloured airmail paper, and the type sizes are 8 or 10 point only. Because of the nature of Miss Firth, who hopped around Britain like a flea, I had to read every word on every page to find her. You won't be treated to all my findings this afternoon, because I think we've had quite enough of dates in particular months, and it all becomes a general jumble. Her biographical details of her life were cruelly expunged post-mortem, but she did leave a trail of breadcrumbs, and she often wrote quite autobiographically, as she referenced her own experiences in an anecdotal way. Through the work I've been able to do here, and using my own long run of the Occult Observer, and the many advertisements for her wonderful work that Miss Firth placed within that, I've been able to, again, piece together her esoteric life as it began, as it happened. There are also ads for her businesses, and she never stopped, really. She was a multifaceted woman who was involved in many things, and as long as she was the leader, it was fine, basically. There's more work to do, but today I hope to be able to give her a voice relating principally to her theosophical years. She was young, big-headed, successful and passionate about her newfound esoteric life. There's a freshness and an immediacy and a joyfulness about her most recent discoveries, and she couldn't wait to tell the world about them. She had great teachers in Amy Bothwell Goss, who ran the sociological department for a long time, E.L. Gardner, Isabel Pagan, H. Bailey Weaver, the Reverend Wedgwood. She studied with the best, as all that generation did, because those people devoted their lives to giving what they knew to the public. The list of what was happening in London alone, month on month, is genuinely very impressive. Even during the war, things shrunk a bit, but very few of the lodges closed down, and they just kept at it. And when you think how difficult it was to travel then, they were absolutely heroic people. Clara Clodd was another one who was indefatigable, and curiously enough, she was a close neighbour in Steeles Road, Hampstead, where the Society of the Inner Light still is. She was at number 10, there at number 38. And it's often made me laugh when I speculate what the two of them would have thought of the Gallagher brothers from Oasis living in Supernova Heights in Steeles Road in the Britpop revolution of the 1990s. I think they would have hated that mania. So, Violet Mary First was born on the 6th of December 1890 in Llandudno in North Wales. She died in January 1946 when she was just 56 of leukemia. It just ripped through her. It was sudden and then she was gone. Dion Fortune being Dion Fortune, as she was by then, death didn't stop her. And she dictated from the great beyond the finishing of her last novel and some various other things as well. She was a great psychic, and basically she used to just lie down there, and the woman who'd been her amanuensis in life was in death. So, as I say, death just didn't stop her. She was, just one of those forces of nature. Her family was affluent, especially her father's, as they produced all the armaments for the British Army. And that tale of Victorian success enabled the succeeding generations to become dryly academic and highly regarded in their spheres. Her father qualified as a solicitor, practiced for a couple of years, and then gave it up and threw in his lot with his entrepreneurial father-in-law, who was involved with, no, this isn't right. No. Well, anyway. With hydro, let's settle for that, who was involved with health hydros, which were very popular here as well as the continent. The father-in-law, I feel, was a bit roguish because he opened one that had no spa nearby. He used to have the water shipped in to giant stone tanks, but they made a lot of money out of it and they had a good time. There's Violet's parents are still much speculated about, and somehow over the years the idea has grown up that her mother was mentally unstable. And if she was, perhaps she had very good reason, because there was a significant drama associated with her infant daughter as Violet apparently died. A full account has been found in the quarterly transactions of the British College of Psychic Science, Volume 3, 1924-5, when Violet first provided them with the full story. Dear Mrs. Mackenzie, I shall be very pleased to give you any particulars of my apparent death in babyhood, as I've heard my mother tell the story, for naturally I cannot recall it. I'm surprised, she knew every damn thing else. I believe I was about 4 months old when I had to be weaned suddenly. This caused serious intestinal disturbances and I became very ill. For 3 days I lay at death's door, and my nurse, who was very devoted to me, went out each day to burn candles in Brompton Oratory and to pray for my recovery, for she was a devout Catholic. On the evening of the third day, the doctor pronounced me dead, and both he and my mother tried to persuade the nurse to accept the fact of my death and to lay me aside, for she'd sat so many hours with me on her knee. This she refused to do, and declared that she would not let me go out, and rather than make a disturbance with her, they let her have her way, and she sat with the apparently dead child on her lap all through the night. During the 3 days of my illness, there'd been a dense fog, and they had not seen the house opposite for the whole time of that. But with the dawn of the 4th day, the fog lifted, the sun came through, and with the coming of the light, I revived. I did not, however, make a complete recovery, as in the case of recorded in your magazine, and the effects of the illness remained with me throughout my childhood. It was only recently that I knew of this incident, but when I heard it, it threw a curious light on feelings I've had ever since I can remember. I've never felt any ties of kinship with my relatives. I like or dislike them according to their qualities, as I do my other friends. I've never identified myself with my name, if you can realise what I mean by that, and I've never had an intimate friend who made use of it. They have also felt it was not me. My face in the glass has never from childhood seemed familiar to me, and I've always looked at my reflection quite impersonally, as it also does not seem to be me. With regard to my supposed death, my own belief is that the soul of the baby VMF really went out, that my nurse's vitality, impelled by the determination that I should not die, supplied some faint and elemental life to the unsouled form on her lap, and that a mature soul, who had recently passed out, took advantage of the opportunity to reincarnate because it had some work it wished to do. All through my childhood, I knew that I had some work to do, and I trained my mind and will for that purpose, though I didn't know what that purpose was. Later on, I knew that I should start this work, whatever it should be, when I was 33, and this has proved to be the case. This leads me to the speculation that the soul which entered the child's body was possibly 33 years of age at the time it disincarnated. I do not know whether these speculations are of any use to you. To me, personally, they are interesting, but I hold no brief for them because I know that they can never be anything but speculations. Because I'm a cynical woman, I looked up when Easter in 1891 was, and lo and behold, it was early April, about 4 months after Dion Fortune was born. And that is the beginning of her messianic complex, which I think she had, really. So, and it's a curious thing for a family not to bother to mention that. They were either very protective parents of their only child to not tell her until she was 30-odd, or she must have known about that a long time before. She was an only child, but a serious and clever one, with an early acknowledgement of her skill with words, being a book of poetry published when she was 14. Violets was followed by more Violets the next year. What makes this noteworthy is that they were both very favourably reviewed severally in the national papers, and that she also sold between 1,000 and 2,000 copies of each of them. Now, poetry is so difficult. I know fashion's changed, but poetry is so difficult to sell. And she achieved her moment of fame. There were photographs, there were little bits of her. The world loved her for it. She and her mother were Christian Scientists by this time. And excuse me, her next widely circulated appearance in print was when she was 18 in 1908. She and her mother were Christian Scientists by this time, and the poem Angels appeared when it was published by them in California. The family had homes in Somerset and in Kensington. Miss Firth had a deep attachment to the West Country. She claimed she was ancient Welsh stock, was proud of her Yorkshire and by descent, thus Viking blood, and loved living in London. She had a nervous breakdown in her teens, and when she recovered, she set out to find what had happened to her by becoming a trendy new psychologist. Women couldn't really get degrees at that time, so she overqualified by going to absolutely everything that was around. And she became an official lay analyst in psychoanalysis at the Medical Psychological Institute in Tavistock Square at the beginning of World War I. And here, if you see her with startling blue eyes, apparently, attitude, and honey blonde hair, then you can see the beginnings of the Valkyrie that she later very firmly believed herself to be. But she says, about that time a club was founded for young Theosophists, designed to act as a channel for the work of the masters, and by some who really wanted a decent meal in a district where most of the restaurants were of poor quality. I joined this club not because I was in sympathy with its aims, for I knew nothing whatsoever about them, but because it was near the clinic where I worked and was a pleasant place to get a meal. Here I met for the first time the teachings of Theosophy, and I'm afraid the introduction was not a happy one. I heard a great deal of irresponsible talk, which I thought was foolish, and with the arrogance of youth I dismissed without further inquiry the whole philosophy and science from which it appeared to be derived, and indulged in a little gentle leg-pulling. Young Theosophists produced their best psychic experiences from my edification, and I replied that we had patients suffering in much the same way at the clinic, and they got better under treatment. This naturally led to strained relations. People turned the other cheek to persecution, but not to ridicule. So, I don't know what... This is Studley Hall, where she worked during the First World War, so that's out of order. So, one day, in an idle moment, I thought I would patronise the meditation class. I'm afraid my mood was one of mischief rather than inquiry, and during the earlier part of the proceedings, I meditated chiefly on the hardness of the chairs. The matter in hand was the transference of thought forms, and with my usual amused contempt I looked on at the performance. Then to my surprise there rose in my mind's eye what psychologists call a hypnagogic, a small brightly coloured picture such as seen when looking through the wrong end of an opera glass. I saw a vision of a herbaceous border full of tall blue plants. The leader of the group then announced that she had made a thought form of delphiniums, which I thought was a curious coincidence. Next there appeared in my consciousness a picture of that unlovely vegetable known as a red-hot poker. And again, the teacher announced that this had been the subject of her meditations. I said nothing because I knew I was in an unfriendly atmosphere, but I thought a great deal. I dismissed contemptuously the ill-considered stories that had been told to me, but this time I saw I was dealing with something genuine and was honest enough to admit it. What Violet did do was to apply the technique she'd experienced to her most helpless clients, and by activating other levels of their brains through the use of meditation, they gradually improved, and she reputedly became the best and most highly paid young therapist in London at the time. She specialised in sexual deviancy, as it was then known, and she and Aleister Crowley were actually very early sexologists, really. But that's another day. But the experience caused a profound spiritual upheaval, and she threw in her job a few months later, and in 1914 she joined the Theosophical Society and the Women's Land Army, and a year later was very much involved with scientific research into the soya bean. There was a great fear during the First World War that Britain would be blockaded and that we would be starved into submission. And so they needed a cheap, reliable and regular source of nourishing food to feed the population. And so the soya bean became, one of those great saviour crops, really. She says, a large portion of my task consisted in spending long hours watching and waiting in a great empty building while brewing bacterial cultures brewed in an incubator. A more ideal situation for what was to follow could hardly have been found. I knew that Theosophy possessed knowledge concerning that which I was undergoing, and I therefore went to the library, which was then in Tavistock Square, and browsed among the books. My first choice fell on the Ancient Wisdom, and I began to read, coming presently to that wonderful passage wherein are referred to the brotherhood of the Great White Lodge, the hierarchy of adepts to watch over and guide the evolution of humanity. I read the pregnant words, still they teach eager pupils, showing the path and guiding the disciples' steps. Still they may be reached by all who seek them, bearing in their hands the sacrificial fire of love, of devotion, of unselfish longing to know in order to serve. Still they carry out the ancient discipline, still unveiled with the ancient mysteries. Upon me the effect of this passage was mantic, and it ran in my head like a tune, and my whole nature gathered itself up into a one-pointed desire to find the masters. I say that my nature gathered itself up, for the conscious will was submerged in the tremendous uprush of the depths. The blind will of the primitive self that is usually expressed in savagery was in me turned into the desire for light. Fierce as thwarted love and stronger than the fear of death was that desire, and there was no price I was not willing to pay. The masters had only to make their conditions for me to comply with them. All day long I moved in a dream, my body performing its duties automatically. My first waking thought was of the masters, my last thought as I fell asleep, and my dreams were coloured with my desire. I seemed to range over rocky deserts in a grey twilight, not upon toiling feet, but with powerful winged beat and the speed of the wind. I had a sense of irresistible power, and always the tremendous desire drove me on, as if it was something outside myself. It was like the throb of the screw on board ship. Awake or asleep, it was always there. One felt it underfoot on deck, one heard it as if one woke in the night. It never ceased to drive the ship towards the port for which her course was set, though it lay invisible as yet below the horizon. I come from that part of Yorkshire which was the Danelaw, and I suppose I reverted to type and threw back to some Viking ancestor. Mildest of people in the ordinary way. She lies. We were liable to go berserk on occasion, and I went berserk in my quest for the masters. For 10 days I continued in this state, and then I found that what I sought. On the 10th night I went to sleep in the ordinary way and began to dream. I dreamt that I was going down a long passage with many doors opening onto it, and at the end of the passage led to the reading room of the old library in Tavistock Square. The passage had been dark, but the reading room was full of sunshine. I stood for a moment in the ray of golden light that came through the window, and then the whole side of the room opened out, and I seemed to be caught up through space and found myself upon a plateau upon great snow mountains, which I knew to be the Himalayas, and I was kneeling at the feet of two of the masters. I could not see their faces, for they were lost in a blur of light, nor could I see the hands, for they were concealed in the loose sleeves of the robes. The robes they wore. But I knew that one of them was the Master Jesus. The other I did not know, save I felt him to be a tremendous intellectual force. I have since learnt to know him as the Most Wise, one of the Lords of Mind and on the Hermetic Ray. To the Master Jesus was given the title of Most Holy, Lord of Compassion. The Master Jesus was clad in a purple robe, and the Most Wise in a robe of dark indigo blue. I was in their presence for some time, but what I said I can remember nothing, save that I was bidden to have more reverence than for that which was holy. I no longer had any sense of power, such as had been with me upon my journey, but was awed, almost cowed, by the tremendous presences before whom I found myself. The Most Holy took no part in the interview, but stood a pace or two behind his companion, and seemed slightly remote, aloof, and very weary, as if some great strain rested upon him. The weariness gave me the impression of physical exhaustion, through which the spirit shone undimmed. The Most Wise, however, seemed to have tremendous driving force, dominant, intellectual. And while I feared him, I adored, and asked nothing better than to enter upon his service. I have learnt since that he is one of the great masters upon the Blue Ray, the Lord of Hermetic Wisdom and Ceremonial Magic. The Master Jesus gave me the impression of having an infinite patience with the weak and the pity of the lowly. Though he would lead me through by rough ways, he would lead gently and slowly, suiting his pace to the most foolish and footsore of his sheep. I have sometimes been asked why it is that I can work with people who have neither intellect nor education, and I think it must be because I myself was trained by a master who did not look for qualities of intellect in his pupils. I must have been half an hour in the presence of the masters, and then I felt conditions change, and I seemed to re-enter the room of the library through the gap in the wall which closed behind me. Vision changed to dream, and I awoke. But the memory of that transcendent experience remained with me and has remained ever since. Was it a dream or an actual experience? That's a matter of opinion. I only know that it was not my inner consciousness. It was not only my inner consciousness, but the outer circumstances of my life that were totally different therefore. When in the morning I looked back upon the breathless adventure, seeking to recover every detail of its memory, I found in my consciousness a certain knowledge that I have been accepted as a pupil by a master. But here is a curious point, for although the whole bent of my temperament was towards the Master of Wisdom, I'd been handed over to the Most Holy, the Master of Compassion, and I was not at all happy about it. I wanted the pace and driving power of the Most Wise. I felt myself to be strong and wished to be worked to my full capacity. I was impatient with the patience of the Master of Compassion. I thought it was a colourless service compared with that of the Master of Wisdom, and there were many struggles before I would submit to do that gentle yet compelling force. I can see now why I was placed under his guidance and not given the more intellectual type of master who was congenial to my temperament. It was in order that I might not develop the powers of the mind which the faults of character uneradicated. Before I had gone very far with my training, however, I was very thankful that my master was the master of compassion, who would not quench smoking flax. I did not know how the pupils of the masters of wisdom fare. I'm sure I could never have stood the training. During the next 3 days, the memory of past incarnations returned to me, right back to my first initiation in Atlantis. It was a practically unbroken record of temple work, save my last incarnation, which was most lurid, and into which I seemed to pack all the experiences I'd foregone during the rest of my evolution. Now, it's quite a simple matter for anyone to equip themselves with a series of egotistical fantasies by way of past lives. But in my case, I not only got back to the memory of initiations in temple lives, but also the memory of the teaching I had received during those lives. So I would like to think that what happened to her happened to lots of other people in the TS at the time. But she had this desire to share it. But something unlocked her very, very deeply and very profoundly through her involvement with the TS. And if you look at those great people that were around at the time, their work was very, very potent. It was very, very valid. And this magical diary, if you like, is very, very, very important to someone beginning to tread on a path, but with a really dramatic thing. And as a Theosophist said to me at some point, it was very impertinent of her to presume she'd been in the presence of Jesus. But this gave her the three rays, the three strands of her later work. The green ray was for nature, the orange ray was for symbolism, especially on the Tree of Life. The purple ray was religion and mysticism, and the direct approach to spirit, devotional and otherwise. Post-war, people were looking for all sorts of answers to the way ahead for the country and for themselves as the generation of young women who'd lost their men to death, disease, disablement and depression. In 1919, influenza killed a staggering number of people too. She'd set up the Firth Weir & Co., which is, the premises are in Westminster Bridge Road still. It's an estate agent's, needless to say now, but her work with the soya bean and vegetarianism started from that time in the First World War. Again, this isn't the next one isn't the right slide, but she'd worked collaboratively with older men professionally and esoterically by this time, and was well aware of powerful women who were leading spiritual significant movements, first through Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Science, then Mina Mathers, the first true initiate into the Golden Dawn Magical Society, which she joined in 1919. Blavatsky, Mari Stopes, the British advocate of family planning, was a very loud voice. Her eugenics seemed to have filtered through to Dion Fortune quite early on. Alice Bailey's first book came out in 19, and of course Annie Besant. She says, then I suddenly saw there must have been priestesses as well as priests, for there is a dynamism in a woman that fecundates the emotional nature of man, as surely as he fecundates her physical body. This was a thing forgotten by modern civilization, which stereotypes and conventionalizes all things and forgets the moon, Our Lady of Flux and Reflux. She also very importantly said that you could be a woman with a man's mind, you could be a man with a woman's mind, and then when you met up on the astral, you met both complete, and you met as and made a complementary pair. So that was quite dramatic, that was quite radical really at the time. It was also quite necessary because there were so few men around. You had to develop that duality within yourself to survive, really, and step out of the passive female role and get a job and feed the kids. So her stuff was bang on topic to that extent. So, and of course, Annie Besant. Annie Besant came home to England in 1919, where she was mainly held in the highest regard. This visit was to change Violet's life because Besant brought B.P. Wadia with her to London, much to the annoyance of several society members who wrote into the Vahan to protest that she was mixing politics and race with spiritual matters. Barman Preston G. Wadia was born north of Bombay in 1881, and I think that, like Violet, he was priggish and sanctimonious by nature to some extent. He'd taken a vow never to tell a lie, which is admirable, but terribly, terribly difficult to live with and terribly idealistic. He'd been forced to resign from his first job on the strength that he might have to tell a lie. He was in danger of breaking his word. So he joined the family firm. 4 months later, his father died. This young man is in charge, makes a huge success of the business, sells it when he's 23, and goes back to studying Theosophy full-time, which he'd taken up when he was 19. He grew to know Annie Besant, and she appointed him the manager of the Theosophical publishing house in Adyar, and later he worked closely with her as the deputy editor of New India and also very much for Indian Home Rule. He was asked to speak at the 1909 White Lotus Day to commemorate the passing of HPB, and he had a speech prepared. He got onto the stage and it all went blurry. He has no memory, he had never ever had any memory of what he'd said because something overtook him. One of the masters spoke through him. When he got off the stage, his curter smells of sandalwood, which it couldn't have been possible to do, and he felt that he'd been used, as I say, by the masters. One of his big criticisms of TS members was their heavy involvement with psychism and sensationalism. His time here was relatively short, as he and Blavatsky were on a European tour of the lodges, and his other purpose was to speak to a parliamentary commission about the plight of the Indian textile workers. Now, Annie Besant famously had absolutely no sense of humour. Dion Fortune didn't have much, and I suspect Wadia had none. So he arrived in May and left at the end of October 1919, and Violet, as she wrote in her review of Who Wrote the Mahatma Letters by H.E. and W. Loftus Hare, published in 1923, was one of the small group of people he gathered together and put in touch with the Himalayan masters. She continues, for what my testimony is worth, I can vouch for the genuineness of these contacts. I certainly got in touch with something, but although it was not evil, it was to me alien and unsympathetic, and it seemed to me that it was hostile to my race, but that's another story. Anyway, the rapport soon came to an end as far as I was concerned. Whether I was cast out or walked out, I cannot be certain. Anyway, the parting was simultaneous and by mutual agreement. Well, there was a fiery combustion, wasn't there? Two big egos bashing together like that. Well, she'd really fallen foul of the first of the three declared objects of the TS, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste or colour. She goes on. Now comes the interesting part of the story. The contacting of me. She tells you it's interesting, I don't. It's her telling you this. She contacting of me with the Himalayan masters had broken my rapport with the Western masters I was accustomed to working with, the masters whose symbol was the rose upon the cross. I was intensely conscious of the difference in the two influences. There was not the slightest chance of confusing them. Intangible as they were unmistakable as they were, to anyone who had any experience at all in this matter of things. After the breaking off of my brief contact with the Himalayan masters, I was left masterless for a period, and I shall never forget the utter devastation of that time. Life was purposeless. My capacities were all reduced to a fraction of their normal quantity and quality. In fact, everything seemed to come to a standstill, and I was like an electric tramcar on the dead end of the line. Then, without warning, I picked up the contacts again of my own masters again, and felt exactly like a lost dog who's been found. I'm the least tearful of creative beings, but this was one of the few occasions in my life when I have wept. So, for what it's worth, I give my testimony to the existence of the masters, and since this has all been my own experience, I see no reason to doubt why it should not have been Madame Blavatsky's experience also. But when tales are told of psychical phenomenon and other marvels, I beg leave to doubt, for that has not been my experience, and appears to me to be incompatible with that experience. In any case, such happenings have no bearing on the real value and validity of the contacts with the masters, which lie in the teaching they give and the influence they exert. Marvels simply serve to rejoice the heart and open the purse of doubting Thomas, and were really, to my opinion, designed exclusively for that purpose in the early days of the TS. They were resorted to in the first place as temporary expedient in the midst of overwhelming difficulties, and having been discovered, were elaborated by folk who had not the excuse of the poor old lady, Blavatsky had, struggling with poverty and ill health and driven by her mission. She was, I believe, a woman of genius, with the unbalanced character that is characteristic of genius. Her writings, for all their manifest defects as literature, are outstanding in their own field and have never been surpassed or even equalled. Even if we have to reckon the Mahatma letters as among her works and not supernaturally communicated, her reputation as a teacher still stands and her work lives after her. I would therefore plead a lenient judgment, for not only was she a woman of genius, but also a psychic, and a psychic is the most suggestible and unstable of beings. Take that temperament and buffet it from pillar to post and back again as she was buffeted, and who can guarantee unfailing righteousness? The only place for even the most minor of adepts is in retreat. The nature of their work makes them too suggestible and impressionable, and too easily swayed by every wind that blows, for it is to be advisable for them to meet the world on equal terms. So, although I accept unreservedly the verdict of Mr. Loftus, Hare and his brother, that the Mahatma letters and their delivery were by all means a question of fake, I would not agree to pass sentence, but suggest that the Theosophical Society be bound over to keep the peace and tell no more fairy tales. For it still has its contacts, even though the Mahatma letters no longer flop onto people's noses, and the spreading abroad of the ancient wisdom, there is work to be done that the world badly needs. Well, that's nice of her, isn't it? She absolutely trashes poor old Blavatsky. And, just gently reprimands, the entire society. Just behave yourself. Things may have been necessary back in the early days, but there's no need for it now, is there? And she saw herself always, she was an empire builder, she saw herself as a successor to these people. She was highly psychic, but she keeps it hidden within this. She doesn't go there, but she's, when it comes out, she'll be better than Blavatsky was. That was written 4 years after her traumatic time with Wadya. And she later wrote, earlier in my occult career, I met a teacher who demanded blind faith as proof of loyalty, and those things concerning which we were required to exercise faith turned out to be sordid irregularities. Now, this may or may not be an oblique reference to her combustible relationship with Wadya. She says in Sane Occultism that the Eastern schools are just as rigorous regarding the freedom of the chela as the Western schools. This point crops up again and again in the Mahatma letters, and a master expressly stated to Madame Blavatsky, "We do not make slaves." Again, thank you. Excuse me.
I think we're running a little short of time. How long do you think we have, Janet?
Oh dear, right, okay. Right, I'll leap ahead a great deal then. In fact, I might just go to that's MacGregor Mathers. That original portrait hangs in the Atlantis bookshop. You're welcome to come see it. Mina Mathers was one of the people that Dion Fortune later trashed, because again it was another woman who had power, and she really didn't like that. Brodinas was in the Stella Matutina. These are the wrong notes. That's Mina Mathers. People she worked with. She, after the war, she felt that Glastonbury was the place to bring King Arthur back to life again. Glastonbury Tor was her Mont Veritas, if you like. She ran a commune in London. She taught a lot in London, and Chalice Orchard again was one of her businesses, and you could go and stay there and receive esoteric teachings. And she lectured on the interpretation of psychic science in the light of psychology. She was a popular lecturer. She taught in Letchworth. She joined the Christian Mystic Lodge in 1920. By 1927, she was the president of it. And she compartmentalised her life. In Queensborough Terrace, they had a different floor and a different room for every one of the organisations that she led. So quite organised there, really. Let me see what I can. She said 2 minutes, yep. Right. One of her concerns was why it was the Eastern tradition had to be brought to Europe. And she writes, it has its outpost in the TS. The traditions are racial. It may be argued that what Rudolf Steiner did for the German-speaking root races, Madame Blavatsky did for the Latin root race languages. Dion Fortune said that she would be the last to belittle the work of that great pioneer and brave servant of the masters, but the fact remains that she brought no more than the kindling of the fire of the West, and until the coals of our native occultism catch, the fire cannot be said to be alight. Her messianic mind saw herself as Dion Fortune, Deus non fortuna, by God not fortune, as just the person to do that very thing. And as I say, her involvement with Arthur was one of the her power bases, if you like, really. The school and her work as a Kabbalist was very, very important. As I say, it still goes on, but her mystical Kabbalah, which was published in 1935, was the first intelligible book, I would argue, on the Kabbalah in the West. That it didn't have the ponderousness of a lot of the other work, and it wasn't written by a Jewess. She brought a fresh light to it. Thought forms has been mentioned this weekend. I think the use of colour in the Golden Dawn and in her Society of Inner Light and esoteric people thereafter, I think thought forms was the beginning of all of that. So she believed in the literal interpretation of the words occult, which is hidden, and esoteric, meaning for the few. She suggests that people may conclude, and rightly, that occult science is really a branch of knowledge which is hidden from the many and reserved for the few. Occult science, rightly understood, is the link between psychology and religion, her two specialist subjects. She said an immense amount of verbiage has gathered around the sacred science since Madame Blavatsky drew back the curtain of the sanctuary, and the Theosophical Society sought to popularise the ancient mystery teaching. In order to estimate the sacred science, we must study the originals and try to penetrate the minds of the great mystics and Illuminati, whose works bear evidence of first-hand knowledge of the supersensual worlds, and she was perfectly qualified to do just that. As her fame grew, she grew into more separate names. She amusingly signed Violet Firth, Dion Fortune and Mrs. T. Penry Evans in one letter in the Occult Review, just so however you knew her, that was an important letter and she wanted you to read it. The Dion Fortune is based on her magical motto, as I said, Deo non fortuna, God not fortune. Dion means daughter of heaven and earth, and Fortuna, a woman of destiny, and she was certainly that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Geraldine. I'm just going to invite Alan Richardson to make one comment, if I may. Do you have any response, Alan, to the portrait that we found of the young Dion Fortune?
Do I have any? What, sorry?
Do you have any response to Geraldine's portrait?
Oh, I thought she got about to rights, really. She exactly as I would have. A formidable woman.
Yes.
And I don't think there's anyone quite like her.
No.
She has a depth of wisdom. She doesn't often put her foot wrong in the things she did. As Geraldine pointed out, she can be somewhat pompous. She was a child of her times.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in which even now I think, well, she got that completely wrong.
No.
So
and she inspired devotion, but it was her way or no way, always. And as I say, I think there's a lot more to be found here on her. As I say, you know, the Vahan, it's a beast of a thing to work through, but it is genuinely useful. But to have a young Theosophist's voice come through so clearly has been a great joy to me, really. You know, we've known about these articles and bits and pieces over the years, but she's coming into a different shape now as a Theosophist. And you can see the theosophical traces throughout all her later work. She never let it go, as it were. I can quite see that she was tricky as a member, but she was also energetic, and people who will give their time and energy to an organisation will always be used. And so she, you know, it was a fair swap, her knowledge and her time for her fame.
See here, not merely a book on Dion Fortune's Theosophical years, but perhaps even a postgraduate thesis.
Yes.
I'd like to thank Geraldine very much.
Pleasure.
For We're going to resume in just a